This is 5.1, lesson 1 about Washington taking office. So let's get started. Success criteria. I will be able to describe each of the precedents set by George Washington. We'll talk about what a precedent is in just a second. So really, we finished talking about the Constitution, the America's new plan of government. And so now we're going to get into what happens after the Constitution is ratified. And of course, as we learned about from the Constitution, Article 2 talks about an executive branch, right, which will be led by a president. And so we have to have a new president, and George Washington is easily elected as president. Everyone deeply respected Washington from the Revolutionary War, and so they call him back to lead. So George Washington on April 30th, 1789, becomes the first president under the new Constitution. Washington set some precedents that would shape the future of the United States because he's the first president, right? So he's going to make some decisions that other presidents that follow him, they're going to look at his example of how it is to be done, basically, how to be a president. So a precedent is something done or said that becomes an example for others to follow. So he set precedents. He set an example for others. The way he did things, people copied, they emulated. They said, okay, that's how it's supposed to be. And so Washington being the first president was really important because he's setting the example for other people. Okay, so there he is. He's number one. He's the president of the United States. And so let's look at Washington's cabinet. So we did learn about a cabinet when we talked about the executive branch. These are some of the advisors of the president. Now, today, the cabinet is a lot larger. But during Washington's cabinet, here are some of the positions. So we have as vice president, John Adams. Okay, John Adams is so technically the vice president is not part of the cabinet, but he's one of obviously Washington's advisors. He's the second in command, I guess you could say. So John Adams is the vice president. We've talked a little bit about John Adams this year, and there he is. So as Secretary of State, we have Thomas Jefferson. Now, Secretary of State is the person, maybe you remember this from earlier, but Secretary of State is the person that deals with foreign countries, okay? That's Thomas Jefferson. We have as Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. So Treasury would be like dealing with money and financial things in the nation. And then as Secretary of War, we have Henry Knox. We call that today Secretary of Defense, but back then it was called Secretary of War. So those are some of the major positions in George Washington's cabinet. And as you may already know, if you're into the musical Hamilton, Jefferson and Hamilton kind of become arch rivals. All right, and we'll talk about that a little bit now. I don't know why they're hidden here. That's okay. So Hamilton and Jefferson become rivals. They become kind of one of the major leaders of two of the first political parties. So Alexander Hamilton here on the left kind of was one of the leaders of the Federalists. And you can see there some of the things that were a part of the Federalist beliefs. Rule by wealthy class. They believed in a strong federal government, hence the name Federalists. They emphasized manufacturing. They had a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning like you could kind of interpret it a little looser, like, no, they meant this, or, that sort of thing. They wanted to align with Britain. They wanted a national bank. That's important. We're going to talk more about that. And tariffs, which are taxes on trade. And then the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, favored rule by the people. Notice how that contrasts with rule by the wealthy class with the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans wanted a strong state government compared to federal government for the Federalists. They wanted to emphasize agriculture compared to manufacturing. They wanted a strict interpretation of the Constitution. In other words, the Constitution needed to specifically say, this is what you do. They wanted to align themselves with the French as compared to the British. They wanted state banks as compared to a national bank. And then they wanted free trade. They didn't want all these tariffs. So those are some of the major differences. We're going to talk more about Hamilton and Jefferson as we go on. But those are some of the major differences in the two. Okay, some challenges in Washington's presidency. So first of all, the Whiskey Rebellion. This is a rebellion by basically farmers again that Washington is able to put down because of the new powers in the Constitution. Debt from the Revolutionary War. Obviously, we've talked about this. They were in debt because of the Revolutionary War. So Washington is still having to deal with that. We have the French Revolution happening, which is, does Washington basically has to try to decide, are we going to get involved? Are we going to help the French or no? And then fighting within his cabinet. So I kind of already alluded to this, but Hamilton and Jefferson fighting, he has to deal with that challenge as well. So those are some of the major challenges in Washington's presidency. So hope you enjoyed. Have fun on the practice assignment. And so goodbye, everyone. Farewell.